Philo is by no means representative of all Jews in Alexandria. At the same time, due to the extent of his surviving work, his education, and his era, the early first century, he provides the best window into Alexandrian Jewish intellectual culture before the advent of the Jesus movements. It pays dividends, then, to begin with him, to see if he can help to specify the intellectual trends that would appear in Christian sources after him. Philo belonged to a tiny minority. He was a wealthy aristocrat, and his wealth may have been in his family for generations. His brother, Alexander, called the Alabarch, was a tax official who loaned money to kings and plated 9 gates, the Jerusalem temple, with gold. Although Philo never spoke of it, it is likely that he owned income-producing estates as well as household slaves. Whether or not Philo was a citizen of Alexandria, he obtained an education as if he were one. Money went a long way in this department, paving the way not only for Philo's encyclical studies in geometry, music, astronomy, grammar, but also for the heights of philosophical learning. Possibly Philo set up a kind of school in his home where he trained students not just in any philosophy, but in the distinctly Jewish philosophy that claimed Moses for its master. The Alexandrian's teaching was duly calibrated for different audiences. He wrote 3 commentary series, 1 an allegorical series, focusing on a detailed exegesis of Genesis, 2 a question and answer series, focusing on exegetical problems in Genesis and Exodus, and 3 an expository series focusing on the creation story, the Mosaic Law, and the lives of the Hebrew patriarchs. On top of all this, he wrote several in-depth philosophical tractates. Philo was familiar with every Hellenistic philosophy and melded elements from Neo-Pythagoreanism, Platonism, and Stoicism to create a mosaic of Mosaic philosophy. Plato was Philo's most revered and most influential philosopher. At the same time, Philo did not comment on the works of Plato, but on those of Moses. To outsiders, the Pentateuch seemed a rough-hewn block of myths and laws, but for Philo, these pages contained the deepest of sacred mysteries. It was Philo's mission as a writer to smooth out the problems in Scripture and, for an initiated audience, to reveal the deeper mysteries of Mosaic lore. On the face of it, Philo's methods foreshadow developments in later rabbinic literature. He constantly compared Scripture with Scripture, often multiple Scriptures, before circling back to his main text. Unlike the rabbis, however, Philo's mind was suffused with the categories and characters of Platonic philosophy, the forms, the logos, the intelligible world, the passions, the virtues, and so on. Philo would admit that the surface meaning of his sacred texts contained problems and improbabilities, such as God walking in a garden, a boat holding every kind of animal, Moses killing an Egyptian, and so on. But understanding the literal meaning of the text was not the end goal. What the text meant in a higher sense was known only to the initiates endowed with advanced knowledge. In short, to allegorical readers. Philo indefatigably allegorized. At the same time, he was careful to maintain Jewish practices. The Sabbath was a symbol of non-action on the part of creation, but it was also a time when Jews did not light fires, plow soil, carry loads, demand deposits, or recover loans. Circumcision symbolized the slicing away of the passions, but Philo also believed that actual foreskins should be removed from male Jewish babies. The animals forbidden in the Torah were symbols of vices, but they were still off of Philo's actual menu. The Jewish temple was a symbol of the cosmos, and the true temple was the mind. Nevertheless, Philo went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and stood in awe of the physical edifice. Toward the end of his life, Philo was wrenched away from scholarly seclusion and selected to lead a 5-man embassy to the emperor after a horrible pogrom in August of 38 of the Common Era. He sailed to Rome and likely stayed there until 41, while he waited for an interview with the Emperor Gaius, who was assassinated in January of 41. Philo probably wrote his political tractates against Flaccus and the initial sections of his embassy to Gaius. While it is true that Philo's outlook became explicitly political at this stage, his intellectual stance probably did not undergo a revolutionary change from Platonism to Roman Stoicism. Nor is it safe to say that Philo wrote his entire expository series and philosophical works in Rome. When Philo perished is unknown, but if he was unable to finish his palinode attached to his embassy, this would suggest a death not too far into the reign of Claudius. Following contemporary currents in Platonism, Philo supported a transcendent God, a God transcending even his Neo-Pythagorean and Platonic counterparts. God was, quote, superior to the good, purer than the one, and more primordial than the monad, unquote. Human reason cannot attain to God, who is totally untouchable and unattainable, nor is nature a clear mirror for knowing the divine essence. Philo confessed God's oneness as his most sacred creed, but God's unity was complex. In human perception, at least, the Godhead was refracted in various ways. The ultimate and unknowable God was the existent, ha-on or ta-an in Greek. Since this ultimate deity was being itself, Philo did not think that a human could share the nature of the existent. The existent is the primal God, the ultimate father of the universe. He may not have directly made the structures made of matter, but he was still the creator. The existent became known on the level of the Logos, which can be thought of as God's mind, an intelligible being who represents the fullness of divinity as far as it can be known to human minds. Philo could call the Logos a second God, but he was not a being independent of God. Below the Logos are the existence two powers, namely the beneficent and ruling powers, whom Philo named God and Lord, respectively. The stars, including sun and moon for Philo, were divine on some level. Under these cosmic divinities were the heroes and daimones of the Greeks, whom Philo called angels, in accordance with his scriptures. To a certain extent, even humans could participate in divinity at its lower levels. The existent could not come into contact with limitless and chaotic matter. Instead, the existent used bodiless potencies to shape boundless matter. The chief of these powers was the Logos, the active cause of creation. The Logos was the chief instrument by which God made the world. He, or it, contained the model of all creatures, made the four elements distinct, and carved out the shapes of animals and plants. The existent is utterly unlike humanity. That is why the model for humanity is the derived divinity of the Logos. Philo identified the human made in God's image and likeness with an ideal or form, ideiatis. The archetype for this form was the intelligible and incorporeal Logos. The relationship implies that the Logos is the model for the human mind, a mind which Philo calls the true human within. Philo named the Logos the iconic human, hakarikana anthropos, based on Genesis 1:26, and God's human, anthropon theou, based on Genesis 42:11. He considered the Logos to be the source and father of humans. The notion of transmigration in Philo is contested, since he only employed its language in passing. In one passage of his allegorical commentary, for instance, Philo noted that disembodied souls close to earth descend to be bound in mortal bodies. When these souls live their lives and then exit their flesh, some of them long for the familiar and accustomed ways of mortal life, and hurry back again, palindromusin authis, to the body. Palindromeo in Philo almost always indicated a movement from bodiless back to bodily things, including the passions. In another passage of the allegorical commentary, Philo argued that humans do not possess anything, even their own souls. Humans are entities that, after death, join with other bodiless entities and hasten to rebirth, eis palingenesia. In context, only flawed souls are reborn, and since they have already died, must be reborn in bodies. In a text from the Questions and Answers series, Philo commented on Exodus 24:12, when God called Moses to ascend Mount Sinai and be there. The ascent to Mount Sinai was taken to be an ascent to heaven, meant for stable minds divorced from flesh. Some souls, however, instead of floating up on eagle's wings, settled downward again, aftika hupanostason, dragged to the extremes of Tartarus. The imagery is pulled from Plato's Phaedrus, which depicts the soul as a chariot sometimes dragged down by the horse of unsteady desire. The true Tartarus is the earthly body and the flames of desire. In short, souls dragged to Tartarus are probably reincarnated to live again on earth. In these passages, Philo may have appealed to pre-existing traditions, but to suppose he was not committed to transmigration depends on what we mean by commitment. Transmigration was not, admittedly, an essential component of how Scripture should be interpreted on the fate of the soul after and also before death, as David Runia says. At the same time, Philo still could believe in transmigration, even if it was not seen as essential or an essentially scriptural doctrine. In my view, Philo thought very seriously about what traditions he passed on. He would not have written what he did if he did not, on some level, accept a notion of transmigration. My sense is that transmigration was a common notion among Alexandrian Platonists, including other Alexandrian Jewish Platonists. Evidently, Philo was not overly concerned about criticism from other philosophers, since there was no official position on transmigration at the time, even in the Jewish community. As a Platonist, Philo was committed to the idea that the soul or mind was superior to the fleshly body. Yet Philo also expressed at least rhetorical disdain for the coat of skin that he wore. He called the mortal body a baneful corpse, the soul's grave, a foul prison, wicked by nature, a plotter against the soul, and the dwelling place of endless calamities. The image of God within humankind was not something based on the internal and external form of mortal bodies, arms, legs, brain, speech, feeling of love, and so on. Rather, the divine image is embodied only in the bodiless mind. At death, the flesh is, or at least should be, definitively shed, as the soul soars to higher spheres. Philo illustrated how, for instance, at the close of Moses' life, his flesh whirled away, and only his divinized mind ascended to God, as if it were a beam of sunlight. On the topic of Moses' deification, Philo did not mince words. The lawgiver was, quote, no longer human, but a god, unquote. He was divinized, changed into the divine, and became truly divine. God appointed Moses as a god. To be sure, Moses was not deemed a god in his own right. He was granted the name and authority of God by divine decree, Exodus 7:1. Philonic deification recognized the nothingness of humanity and never fostered tyrannical arrogance or a sense of entitlement. Deification was the process of becoming an entirely bodiless and purified mind, noetification. Such minds did not haunt the earth, but stayed forever next to God in immaterial realms. In principle, at least, the fate of Moses was open to all. Philo wrote that by the grace of God, it's reasonable for a mortal to participate in deathlessness. But grace was in part built into nature. Philo called the human mind a fragment of the Logos. Thus, simply by virtue of being human, that is, having mind and rationality, one already has a share in divine reality. The human mind is at least partially constituted by divine breath or spirit, Greek pneuma, breathed into the first human being. Philo rooted this view in Genesis 2:7. God breathed into the first human's face breath of life. For Philo, the medium of pneuma was the logos. All human beings have a reflection, fragment, or ray of the shining logos within them. Since the logos is God, or God in relation to the world, Philo could say that God breathed into Adam a portion of his own deity, tes diou theotitos. Consequently, the human mind is a fragment of that divine and blessed soul, evidently referring to the logos, and so the human soul is a divine fragment, apospasma theon. Humans became divine by participation in the divine. As true being, Philo's primal God is divine in and of itself. Other divine beings, by contrast, need to participate in the divinity of the existent to gain the name theos. In Philo's thought, there were both shareable and unshareable attributes of divinity. Absolute being and eternality are unshareable qualities, enjoyed by the existent alone, whereas immortality and ruling power can be shared. A human could become divine by participating in these shareable divine qualities, among which Philo added other attributes such as repose, passionlessness, and immutability. We know that Philo was a Jew and practiced the precepts of the Jewish law. But what he did on a daily basis is unknown. If Philo the urban dweller was not, or perhaps could not, be rigorously ascetic, he still lauded ascetic communities such as the Essenes and Therapeutae. These communities practiced celibacy, abstention from food, and withdrawal from society. They were pictured as communities of study, of spiritual and social equality, and of worship, prayer, and singing. Their banquets were contrasted with the feasts of decadent luxury Philo was accustomed to in both Alexandria and Rome. The people of these communities lived entirely the life of the mind, as if their bodies had already worn away. Even if Philo's descriptions of these communities are not entirely accurate, they at least represent his own ideal. Some sort of bodily discipline is the natural outcome of Philo's theology. If the true human, the human made in the image of the Logos, is the mind, then that is what one lives for. The mortal body is an appendage, and often an annoying one. It should be regimented and deprived until it is wholly obedient to mind. What matters is study and meditation, and such activities can only be practiced without bodily distractions and social entanglements. Philo was probably married, but he wrote as if he was not. He longed for the peaceful life of his country estates, even though he apparently spent most of his time in the hustle and bustle of the city. He likely practiced a moderate asceticism, restricting food intake and refraining from sex after his children were born. His practice and appreciation of ascetic currents would resonate with later Christian ascetic movements in Alexandria. On my scale of Alexandrian theological tendencies, Philo scores a perfect 6. He upheld a transcendent God, the existent, distinguished creative powers from the existent, the Logos and unnamed auxiliaries. He upheld a manifestation of God, the Logos, as the archetypal human. He endorsed the tradition of transmigration, rejected the corruptible flesh as unworthy of salvation, and proposed the deification of the mind. As we shall see, these 6 theological features will later appear among Christian theologians in Alexandria. The overlap shows, first of all, that there was no strong break between Jewish and Christian theology in Alexandria during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Despite any setbacks Alexandrian Jews suffered during this time, Christians upheld Jesus as the Messiah and came to identify him as the Logos, but these affirmations did not dictate the nature of their theology as a whole. Alexandria in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was vibrant and intellectually diverse. At the same time, there seems to have been a fairly distinctive intellectual climate, or set of intellectual, largely Platonizing and Pythagoreanizing tendencies there. Whether or not the earliest Christians of Alexandria read Philo, they shared a theological climate he belonged to, which helps to explain why they posited similar tenets and manifested like tendencies.